and in actual fact we were women. So I really appreciated that you brought out that sort of, that it wasn't all fun and games. And the other thing I want to say to Pauline is I'm just fascinated by this idea that, you know, what happened to Renaissance man? I mean, you know, when did we decide that people could only do one thing well? You know, it makes sense to me, because I know a lot of creative people who do more, you know, that if you had that kind of intelligence, drive, creativity, talent, bravery, you know, that you could do more than one thing. And, you know, I would say, oh, it's America because they always want a brand, you know, like you say, well, some artists can just keep churning it out. They want to brand you, and it's easy to sell something that's known. But you say in the 50s it was just as bad. That
Absolutely. I mean, we really have to cite the educational system too. And as a fellow Brit, you must know that art subjects were regarded as recreational subjects and non-academic. And, you know, if you took some of the arts subjects, you then couldn't do some of the science subjects. And so the educational system pretty well determined and kept all that separation going. Now, when my brother was accepted for the equivalent of university at the age of 16, that was based purely on his portfolio. And usually you need, as you know, O and A levels. And they said to him, just get the absolute minimum amount that you need for university entrance and you're in. Now, that was unusual, but that was art school. So, I mean, he was clearly never going to be a doctor, was he? I mean, a medical doctor. Because he'd have to have done a whole different education. So I think that's got something to do with the revolution in the 60s, because it swept aside a lot of those rigid boundaries between what were regarded as legitimate academic subjects and recreational subjects, like art. So non-academic subject art in my day.
Well, going back to something you just mentioned, in terms of you know, the assassinations and whatnot, there was a book that was written about 2 years ago called The Beatles' Second Album. It's by a very good writer named Dave Marsh, who writes for Rolling Stone, used to write for Rolling Stone. And he contends in this, and it's a whole album just where he talks about this album, the second album, that wasn't even released in England. It was only released here, and it was made up primarily of songs from 2 or 3 other albums that had already been released in the UK. And he contends that it was just totally coincidental, the whole thing, that, you know, the Beatles released with the Beatles on November 22nd, the same day that, you know, Aldous Huxley dies and that JFK is assassinated. It all happens within about 8 hours. And that they come to New York, and actually to Washington, D.C. as their first concert in February of '64, and that this huge amount of goodwill towards them is totally coincidental, has nothing to do with JFK being shot. But I have to say that I just think it's crazy to think that you can take 2 huge historical events, and the way the entire country and a lot of the world was in grief at this point. So all of a sudden this huge, you know, Boeing or whatever it is lands at Idlewild, and joy gets off of it, you know, and everybody's going, yes, joy, you know, as opposed to like death, you know.
The Beatles will save us.
Yeah, the Beatles will save us. There you go. So basically, this thing is just starting. My series on the Beatles, this is really just the beginning of it. I'm starting at where I came in contact with it, and it's, for me, it's metabolic. I'm bonded on that level because of what was going on with my family and this country and my interest in history. So, but it's not all going to be 1964 for the entire series. It's just, this is where I'm starting, you know.
There's a question here and then one over there.
Many parents, or older people, let's say, at the time, felt that the Beatles were a symptom of an anti-establishment revolution, whether it was through their music or through the way they were promoted in the media. Do you feel that your work reflects that?
Well, you know, what the establishment is, it's pretty weird to be, you know, 58. And, you know, when I first started painting, I was, well, I mean, when I first got my first studio, I was 23. So there actually were still people older than me around. And now I'm wondering what I'm still rebelling against. But on some level, you know, I think it reflects that. I try to, you know, in the 80s, I was really invested in things like, you know, history and irony. And now, I think it's more like history. I'm trying to have it be a little bit more integrated. I don't want to stop with clever. I want it to have something that's expansive as opposed to just definitive, and I hope it's not preachy. You know, I hope it's not too like didactic or something, but you know, I'm just trying to reflect the things that move me, you know.
There was a question back there.
So what I was wondering is, in addition to growing up with the Beatles, my parents were huge fans, something that really always gravitated me to them, and it took me a while to isolate, was this amazing, enthusiastic, creative, almost unlimited creative capacity between the members of the band. And like, you know, they didn't have the ability to think in 5-part harmony like Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. They didn't have the informed poetic depth of the Doors, in my own personal opinion, except maybe John at his most felicitous. But there was just this insane creative ability, sort of, that almost, it seemed like they could have kept on going. They could have written interminably. And my question for Pauline is, you were right there at the beginning of that. You knew John, and you were like at least sort of privy to his really powerful artistic bond with John Lennon, and you were there for the early rehearsals. My God, I can only imagine. What in that Liverpool environment in the late 50s, if anything, could you attribute that amazing creative force to? Like, was there anything going on in that particular corner of the world at that time that you might be able to logically link to the miracle that was to happen?
Well, it's such a powerful question. I feel I want to trivialize it and say, I think it must have been in the water. And, you know, if we put them in context, I mean, we're talking about a provincial city and a town within that, where one of the running jokes was that mothers give birth to chauvinists. And so, you know, the whole culture would mitigate against them being powerfully creative people. But I noticed in your question, apart from the plural, the Doors, everyone else was an individual. But you always refer to the Beatles as the Beatles. Because if we really try and analyze what was different about the Beatles that made them, apart from all the stuff about the machine and the money and the publicity and the way they were managed, they all had a particular creative spark that was different enough from one another for it to blend together well. And although much is made of Paul and John being the primary writing team, there's more and more attention now being given to the creative force of the whole group right from the very start. You know, when you jam, you know, the lead guitarist will probably say, "Nah, that doesn't quite work. Well, let's try it this way." Or a lyricist might have written a line, and the singer might say, "That's too clumsy. I can't get my mouth around that. What about so-and-so?" So there's much more collaboration, I think, in any group artistic endeavour than is given credit for. But I just come full circle again to being unable to explain it properly, because all the indications were against anything quite so spectacular.